Alrighty. Let's get this going. Let's make sure everything sounds good. Just double check. Okay, I think we got it going, which is good. We'll just share it and we'll get going. Exciting, exciting. Okay. All right. I think, if I am not mistaken, we're ready to get going. Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whoever you are, wherever you are. My name is Dr. Patrick Lockwood, and for the purpose of this podcast, I'm just Patrick, and this is UnShrink Me, a weekly podcast dedicated to you, the consumers of mental health services. In a world where everyone's seemingly focused on self-improvement in some way, shape, or form, especially because people see it all the time on social media platforms, I like to do this podcast every week to make sure we can clarify, criticize, and explore important ideas for the sake of so-called mental health. And that is why we are here on UnShrink Me. So welcome to UnShrink Me. This is a weekly podcast hosted on my YouTube channel, The Psychology Checkup. I am Patrick Lockwood. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of California. But for the purposes of this podcast, I am just Patrick. So please do not sue me. This is not specific advice dedicated to you, the person watching or listening to this. This is just me ranting and raving about things that make sense to me, hopefully, and criticizing things that might make it easier for you, consumers of mental health services, to get the most out of those services. So I am not trying to directly treat you or your loved ones. I am just sharing ideas. Feel free to cancel me. That is much appreciated. But please do not sue me. So this week, we have a lot of important things to discuss. We are going to start with some discussion of anxiety, and then we will talk about Chris Williamson, a very popular YouTuber, and I do like him, just to be clear, even though I'm going to criticize a couple of things. And then we will talk all about defense mechanisms, thanks to my good buddy, Nick Tabor. So that's the basic agenda today. And today, as always, this podcast is not not sponsored by Celsius, but I do love this stuff. Things always get appropriately spicier with the little extra energy. So, without further delay, we're going to kick this podcast off with a discussion of anxiety, because this should be, in theory, something simple to discuss, but who knows? This is some easy grist for the mill. And so, I'm going to retweet it right now. And if you are new to this podcast, by the way, everything that I discuss usually comes from Twitter, sometimes Instagram. But my handle on Twitter is at AlobhaPatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. So you can follow along live on Twitter. Hello, Seth. Glad you're here. And I will be, if you're new to this, responding to the folks in the chat. And so if you are just listening to this and you have a chance to see the chat, please do, because people say interesting and important things in the chat. So anyways, I'm on Twitter at AlobhaPatrick. And my first post of the day comes from the Holistic Psych at TheHolisticPsycyc. Her name is Dr. Nicole LaPera, who I believe is very popular on this platform and Instagram. So, let me retweet this real quick. Hey, Phil, glad you're here. Shout out to everyone here in the chat. All right, so, all right. Dr. LaPera, I guess she's a psychologist, I can't quite tell. But here's what she said about 3 days ago. She said, anxiety comes from the inability to regulate your emotions. And so I can just tell you that there are so many things that are wrong with that one simple sentence. That's a deceptively simple sentence. And so, again, she said, hey, Jonathan's here too. Glad you're here, Jonathan. All right. So we got a crew building here in the chat. That's awesome. So, again, Dr. LaPera said 3 days ago, anxiety comes from the inability to regulate your emotions. So this sentence tells me a number of things about Dr. LaPera. Maybe she's helpful or intelligent in other ways. I can't tell. But this is, as Seth just said in the chat, this is one of the dumbest things I've heard and read online in a long time. It tells me she understands nothing about anxiety, where it comes from, what it's for. I encourage people who think like Dr. LaPera to read authors like Jaak Panksepp, Lisa Feldman Barrett, Gray. There's just so many interesting people. You can even read like Evolutionary Perspectives from David Buss. And so it's really quite simple. And yes, Seth, I agree with you. It's the dumbest thing I've read this week, which is pretty impressive because there's lots of stupid stuff on Twitter. So again, she said, and I quote, "Anxiety comes from the inability to regulate your emotions." And what I will tell all of you is that's stupid and incorrect in a dozen different ways. I'll just name 3 ways in which it's very stupid and incorrect. Way in which, number 1, assumes that anxiety is not an emotion. So grammatically, it's just a very stupid sentence. Number 2, anxiety doesn't come from anywhere. Anxiety is always there. If you actually look at the neuroscience of anxiety and read the authors, I wrote a book once upon a time called The Fear Problem. If you want to check that book out on Amazon, or it's on this YouTube channel for free as an audiobook, I tell you all about the research on anxiety and fear. And anxiety is always happening. It's literally not ever happening. It's always happening. And so if you want to think of this metaphorically, anxiety is like a dimmer switch. It's happening 1% up to 99%. It is never not happening. And so anxiety is a tonic experience, not a phasic experience. So sometimes anxiety is very minimal to the point that we don't notice it and it's just background noise. Or it's super, super intense and it's happening in intense ways such that you're having other symptoms like panic and flashbacks and heart palpitations and things like that. So anxiety is always happening, and it does not stem from the quote-unquote inability to regulate your emotions. Third reason this is a really stupid, inaccurate thing is because the idea that it comes from one place is also absurd. And so anxiety is actually a rather complicated experience because anxiety is a very useful emotion. It is not inherently pathological. Anxiety is very useful socially. Anxiety is useful in public. Now, sometimes anxiety gets mixed with positive connotations and positive thought processes, so it feels more like excitement. But the neurological basis of anxiety, which is some combination of cortisol, norepinephrine, and the like, is always happening. It's just a question of to what degree. And so anxiety can take on many colors and shapes. And it's useful most of the time. Anxiety is probably one of the more useful emotions, including if you read authors like Freud over 100 years ago. And so there's no one who is actually a competent clinician who believes anxiety is bad. The question is, in what ways is it serving you and in what ways is it not serving you? Number 4, I said I was going to do 3, but here's number 4. If you can't regulate your emotions, you'll probably experience a wide array of experiences. Some people, when they can't regulate their emotions, experience extreme anger or extreme sadness, for instance. And so the inability to regulate emotions has nothing to do, basically, with anxiety, except for how much anxiety you experience. But anxiety is always there, and it does not come from the inability to regulate your emotions. The inability to regulate your emotions can have all sorts of consequences in terms of what you think and feel. And anxiety is just not part of that. So, Dr. LaPera, I don't know what you're doing. I don't even know why you're there. But God bless you. I'm glad you're successful, I guess. Phil says anxious is a good thing. It can be. Sometimes anxiety is very impairing. So I'm not saying it's all good. Sometimes anxiety is terrible in the case of PTSD, panic attacks, and so forth. But anxiety in and of itself is not a bad thing. And it does not come from the inability to regulate your emotions. So, boy, that's just, you got to watch out for the super online types because they say stupid stuff like that. It's crazy. Jonathan Cogburn says, show me a single person who'd ever planned for their future if they didn't have some nominal amount of anxiety. Exactly. Anxiety is perhaps one of the most useful internal states because, genuinely speaking, it can prompt us to do all sorts of great things in the moment and in the future. It can prompt us to plan, as Jonathan said in the chat. It can prompt us to speak up for ourselves. It can prompt us to hold our tongue when we're about to say something stupid. So it's very useful in many situations. So the idea that anxiety is A, bad, and B, like stemming from the inability to manage yourself is absurd. It's like saying that, heat comes from the inability to manage the temperature. It's like, no, heat is always there. It's always a question of to what degree you're experiencing heat. There's no such thing as a world without heat, for instance. So it's just a question of how much heat and how is that heat useful or not, It's like saying all heat is bad, which is really stupid. So again, friends, people online like Dr. LaPera, I don't know that I would spend too much time scrolling their feed for wisdom and insights. Maybe she's a great person. Maybe she's awesome to her family and friends. Maybe she's brilliant in ways I cannot understand. As of right now, I can't see it. With tweets like that, holy cow. So that is our easy, cheap warm-up for today. Dear Lord, dear God. Let's talk about Chris Williamson. So Chris Williamson, I think his handle on Twitter is at ChrisWillX, if I'm not mistaken, at Chris Will X. But let me just make sure because I don't want to give the wrong handle. Yes, Chris Williamson, famous podcaster, YouTuber, former reality TV star, nightclub promoter. His handle is at ChrisWillX. I like Chris for various reasons. I think that sometimes he has interesting podcasts and so on and so forth. And I think that generally he says some useful things. And so this critique I'm going to have here is not because I don't like him and think he's a bad person or something. So here's the thing that I do not like. What I do not like is that Chris brings on these guru types like, I think this is Mark Manson who came on his podcast. And Mark is one of those like pseudo professionals online who just became famous for who knows what reason anymore. So let me just retweet this clip. Just a second. Here we go. Okay. So the clip and the person who's probably just a content troll or a bot or something said, here's the condensed wisdom from Mark Manson's 10 years of therapy in 1 minute on Chris Williamson's podcast. Number one, no one is coming to save you. You're responsible for your life, even the parts that aren't your fault. Number two, strong boundaries beat weak ones every time. Number three, most problems don't get fixed, in quotes. You just learn to live with them. Live well with them, excuse me. Number four, your mind lies constantly. Tell it to shut the fuck up, which I do agree with. Number five, stop trying to convince people to like you. The right ones won't need convincing. Number six, sometimes the best move is letting a dream die. And number seven, only a few people will truly matter long term. Keep them close. Okay, so again, the heading for this tweet is Mark Manson's 10 years of therapy in 1 minute gold. Okay. First off, Mark Manson, I don't even know who he is. I don't think he's anyone in the profession who's worth listening to from what I can tell based upon his tweets online. He says like overly pithy sounding things without any substance to them most of the time from what I can tell. But Mark, come at me. Let me know. So here's the condensed wisdom again. And let's just go through each of these 7 things in sequence. Number one, no one is coming to save you. So 10 years of therapy in 1 minute, right? So number one from 10 years of therapy in 1 minute is no one is coming to save you. You're responsible for your life, even the parts that aren't your fault. And this is just patently not true. As a professional, I can tell you that although I encourage people to take more responsibility for their lives, the idea that there are no other people in their lives that are supposed to help them is absolutely absurd and bullshit. And so the idea that, quote unquote, you're responsible for your life is just patently not true. You're responsible for enlisting support in your life, effectively, is what I would say in that regard. Certainly, you're responsible for your habits like eating enough, sleeping enough, and exercising enough, as I always talk about online. However, you're also responsible for making sure you enlist the right kinds of support in your life. Now, sometimes people are truly fucked because some people, genuinely speaking, grew up in atrocious circumstances. They grew up in the middle of war. They grew up in the middle of famine. They grew up in the middle of poverty in the United States. They grew up in the middle of gang violence. They grew up in the middle of child sex trafficking rings. There are dozens and dozens of iterations of growing up in terrible environments. And what I will tell you all is that is not your fault. And there's no picking yourself up by your bootstraps in some of those circumstances, especially if you grow up with no role models whatsoever. And so it's not like people randomly just figure it out. Some people are screwed. And the idea that you can kind of like save yourself in all circumstances is absurd. Now, can the average person do a little more to quote unquote save themselves? Yes. But number one is just patently an overgeneralization and bullshit. Number two, strong boundaries beat weak ones every time. Strong, what does strong mean in this context? Does it mean being firm no matter what? I can tell everyone as a clinician who is rather successful that generally speaking, your boundaries need to be firm yet flexible because circumstances change with time. The idea that you can set a boundary and live with it for the rest of your life across all circumstances is horseshit. That's just guru philosopher nonsense. And I can give dozens of examples with different families I've worked with, couples, and individual patients where their boundaries did have to change as their life circumstances changed. It is absurd to imagine that one boundary you set will never change. There are probably only 2 or 3 types of boundaries for most people that stay permanent. Like, you can never have an affair on me might be one of those boundaries that stays permanently the same. But most other boundaries might have to be a little flexible depending upon the circumstances. So again, that's just one of those like pseudo-therapy, pseudo-smart sounding, easy to understand bullshit things. Number 2. Number 3, most problems don't get fixed. You just learn to live well with them. Again, this is sort of true. Sort of true. It depends upon what the problem is. So if you have a personality disorder, yes, you certainly have to learn how to live with that and manage it. However, if you have PTSD, you can certainly get substantial symptom relief. If you have obsessive compulsive disorder, you can have substantial symptom relief. If you have a terrible couples therapy problem, you can get substantial relief and actually improve things and come out stronger. So that's not true also. The idea that most problems don't get fixed, depending upon how you define fixed. If you mean perfectly erased from your memory, like Sunshine of the Spotless Mind or whatever, yeah, that horseshit doesn't exist. But if it means like so substantially gone that you don't think about it anymore, it's not really a problem for you, tons of things in clinical psychology are of that nature. So again, 1, 2, and 3 seem like pretty, oversimplified horseshit at this point. Number 4, your mind lies constantly. Tell it to shut the fuck up. This one I love. I'm all about it, Mark. You stole my heart with this one. This one's great. I can't agree more. The fact that anyone, whether it's a person diagnosed with a mental illness or a person who doesn't have one, listens to their mind, it's the worst thing in the world. Your brain is a PR machine. Essentially, your conscious mind is a PR machine. It's trying to take in information from your body, your memory, your circumstances, the environment around you, how you feel, the temperature, the smells, the germs in the air, the food you eat, and just create a predictive formula for how you should do something to keep yourself, theoretically speaking, safe or alive. It's a PR machine. And because we're overloaded with information, we're just bombarded with bullshit in our mind. So the vast majority of people should not listen to their thoughts, should practice something mindful, in my opinion, should practice non-attachment and non-judgment, and just go do the next thing that you feel an impulse to do. That would be my general recommendation. But again, don't listen to your mind. Your mind lies to you. I agree, Mark. You nailed me with this one. Out of 4, 3 of them suck. 1 of them is great. And most good therapies, cognitive therapies, behavioral therapies, psychoanalytic therapies, teach you to have a better relationship with the lies that your mind tells you. So, he's right. Number 5, he said, stop trying to convince people to like you. The right ones won't need convincing. Again, this is horseshit because relationships take time to develop. You cannot develop a relationship perfectly quickly. It is impossible to just be like famous friends and for everything to always be great. That's crap. Some people will get along with us easier, but the idea that we don't have to put effort into relationships, whether it's about liking us or anything else, is horseshit. So if it's easier to have fun with people and easier to get along with people, that's often very useful. And that's probably good information about the kinds of similarities you have in terms of principles, interests, personality, whatever. That being said, sometimes people get along for terrible reasons. Sometimes we get along because we have the exact same resentments. My spouse cheated on me, your spouse cheated on you, fuck them, right? That's terrible. And so that's probably not a good reason to get along with people. So again, number 5 is oversimplified horseshit. Be careful about it, because I just gave you a good counterexample of how it's not good for you and your well-being. Number 6, sometimes the best move is letting a dream die. So this one's tricky again, like the other 5. So sometimes that's true. Sometimes people have grandiose designs about being famous, about being rich, about being hot, or whatever it is. And the problem is extreme expectations or perfectionistic expectations will short-circuit you and self-sabotage you. Most of the time, excessive perfectionism is built on pathology. So the idea that you should have a grandiose dream or an excessive dream is, for most people, a really stupid idea. So 6 is kind of true. However, you should still have dreams and you should still have expectations of yourself. You should be careful about if your goal and your dreams are too big or not. Because not everyone's a super genius. Not everyone's going to be so prepared for the lucky opportunity that they've made their dreams happen. And, it's like not everyone's going to be a supermodel. Not everyone's going to be rich, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So sometimes the best move is letting a dream die. But what does sometimes mean? And how are we defining sometimes? And number 7, finally, only a few people will truly matter long term. Keep them close. So this is yet again another one of those like pseudo-profound sounding things that's actually not profound, number 1, and number 2, not accurate. So the idea that only a few people will truly matter, it's just there's so many weasel words in there like few and truly. Is few 3? Is few 7? Is truly like existentially long-term keep you alive if you're overdosing? Like, what do you mean by truly? So the truth of the matter is most people need a series of relationships, and there is no perfect playbook for figuring out what relationships matter. So developing the right kinds of friendships, work relationships, romantic and family relationships, it takes time and it evolves. Relationships are dynamic and evolving. And so the idea that you can pick the right 3 people and just be solid for 50 years or something is absolute crap. You're not going to know sometimes. Sometimes it's luck. Sometimes you have to grow a little bit to find those relationships. Sometimes it's God. So what I will tell everyone is that if you haven't found that crew of people that's got your back, keep trying to find them. Keep working on developing yourself and figuring out what matters to you, what your principles are, what your skills and talents are, and how you can find other people to make your life better. Because we need other people to make our lives better. We need ourselves. We need to be accountable to ourselves and grow and try and succeed and struggle. But we also need other people. So again, of these 7 statements, only one of them I think is pretty universally true. And the rest of them are like, well, it depends, and why is it so pithy sounding? So yet again, Mark Manson, I don't know what to tell you, buddy, but like, you keep saying the pseudo-profound stuff, and I just, again, like, people are complicated, life is complicated, relationships are complicated, mental health is complicated. Why do people keep saying these overly simplistic things? Just create a boundary and hold it forever. Like, that's crap. That's absolute crap, because that boundary might need to change. Maybe you create a good boundary with someone who's really sick, but maybe you replace that person with a better person, so that boundary has to change, right? So, again, it's very important to not take overly pithy sounding, overly simplistic sounding stuff from your online friends. Because these online people, they don't know you, they don't understand you, and if they're going to give you like high-level advice, it's probably not going to be in your benefit because you might be more complicated than this overly vague advice, perhaps. Just saying. So far, we have Dr. LaPera and we have Mark Manson. as the gurus of today's podcast, which is why this podcast is called UnShrink Me, because shrinks are gurus, know-it-all gurus. And these two, I think, qualify quite nicely. So thank you, Camus, whoever you are, for the grist for the mill. And I say you should listen to Chris Williamson because he does have cool and interesting people on his podcast. However, he also has a bunch of like pseudo-spiritual grifters on his guru podcast as well. He likes gurus. Chris likes mentors because he probably didn't have much of a dad in his life, is my guess. All right. So, Jonathan says, Patrick, why do you keep ruining people's carefully constructed oversimplifications? You party-pooping buzzkill. Yeah, I know. I'm such a buzzkill, aren't I? Wouldn't it be great if we could just live with a bunch of simple truisms and life would get better? You know, like our buddy Jordan Peterson, just make your bed. Now, obviously, there's much more to it. If you read his book, 13 Rules, he tries to explain more about what he means by that simple, pithy sentence. But Mark Manson does no such thing. And so what I would tell everyone is that if the person you're listening to or reading has simple, pithy things, make sure to catch the more complicated version of that simple, pithy-sounding thing, because just maybe, perhaps, there's more complicated context for that thing and how it applies to your life. Okay? Okay. Yeah, I'm a buzzkill, that's for sure. You know, it's just like, maybe it's because I don't want people to get fucked by the things that I say that I care so much. I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Possibly. Or maybe not. I don't know. All right, let's get to the topic du jour because this is, we're about halfway through today and there's just so much to say about this topic and I cannot wait to hear what some of the folks in the chat have to say too. So, the topic du jour today is about defense mechanisms. And so before I even retweet anything and, state my particular critiques and ideas, let me just say this as simply as humanly possible without being oversimplified. Being a person is very difficult most of the time because most of the time we are conditioned by society and life to think, to plan, to plot, to scheme, to hide, because relationships are not all good and all forgiving. Life is not super safe, even though we live in the safest time in history in the West in many places. Relationships are not this magical Disneyland place where everything is perfectly curated and safe and all this stuff. So, what I'm about to say about defense mechanisms comes with the backdrop of course we have to be defensive because relationships are not inherently safe. The idea that relationships are inherently safe is not true even with the secure attachment, if that crap matters to you. Relationships are never inherently safe. Family relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, colleagues, nothing in life is ever permanently or perfectly safe. There's ambiguity, there's imperfection, there's complexity. That is normal, and trying to disavow that is a version of what we might call denial, which I'll get to in a little bit. Okay? So that's the preamble for this discussion of defense mechanisms, so that we can have some reasonable human standards of relationships. So I'm going to repost this right now. Again, if you're new to this and you're listening for the first time, my handle on Twitter, where I post the content I critique, is at AlobhaPatrick. At ALOBHAPATRICK. And here we go. Ryan says, but I want my safe space. Well, screw your safe space, Ryan. Ryan's a rather safe person, I would say. Okay, so I'm not going to fully explain all of the drama and the context of this. I will try to summarize it respectfully. And dear Nick Tabor, his handle on Twitter, by the way, is at NICKTABER. But basically, the idea, generally speaking, is, and I'm going to tell you exactly what he said, and I'm going to try and explain the context. So here's what he said. Pro tip, if you screw someone over as a professional, but you don't want to be held accountable for it, say that the patient is in the devaluation phase of the idealization devaluation process. So the basic backdrop is there's a war going on Twitter. It's probably one of the dumbest wars that's existed on Twitter, other than maybe gender wars or things like that. But there's the anti-psychiatry war on Twitter. And I don't know if I belong on a side or something like that. I don't know, maybe. But let's just get into it. So the basic gist is Nick has been in a variety of interactions with people about, what exactly happens when people struggle in therapy or succeed or fail. And if they fail, why do they fail? And one of the conversation tangents about anti-psychiatry, pro-psychiatry is that it's easy to whitewash the failures of therapy and the failures of professionals by saying it's just the patient's defenses that cause the therapy to fail or the psychiatry to fail. And so he said, again, pro tip, if you screw someone over, but you don't want to be held accountable for it, say that they are in the devaluation phase of the idealization devaluation process. And so I think, to be fair, to summarize, tell me if I'm being fair, I think what he's saying is some psychiatrists, some therapists, psychologists, whatever, will explain away the patient's struggles in therapy and the reason they're not getting anything in therapy or failing in therapy if it's just that the patient is defending against the relationship and devaluing the professional. Something like that. I think that's a good general statement. And if anyone disagrees with that, come at me and I will change my tune if it's reasonable. So here's what I said 2 days ago after that. Here's what I said. I said, and I quote, defense mechanisms are real. People use them all day. Mentally ill people usually need to rely on the so-called immature defense mechanisms like idealizing or devaluing, either more frequently or more incongruently with their goals. And I will explain this at length in my podcast on Saturday. So let's be clear about a couple of things that I said. Number one, psychological defense mechanisms are real. I think that there's no clinician I've ever met that disagrees with that statement. If anyone out there disagrees, please let me know, and please let me know on what basis you disagree. The idea that people are just like completely 100% aware of what's happening inside and talking about all their motivations, I don't think anyone believes that. I believe that most people believe we have hidden motivations. I also said people use defense mechanisms all day. So again, it's very important, I believe, to take people seriously and take their complexity seriously. If you really want to help people, if you're out there right now and you're listening to this podcast and you are in one of the helping professions, you're a nurse, a doctor, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a therapist, a counselor, a Christian counselor, a coach of some kind, whatever. I think the idea that people are defended and use different defense mechanisms throughout the day to stay sane is a valuable and reasonable idea. Because if you read the original works on psychological defenses, the ego defenses from Anna Freud and the people up through the 70s, like Vaillant, Vaillant, it's impossible to live all day without using your defenses. Jonathan says, I disagree on the basis of being unnecessarily disagreeable. Well, that is why I love you, Jonathan. You are just temperamentally extremely disagreeable over and over and over again. Perhaps the most disagreeable person I've ever met. So people use defenses all day to stay sane. So what does that mean exactly? What that means is you have a conscious mind. Jonathan says that's definitely not a defense. So you have a conscious mind. You have an inner monologue that you can audibly pay attention to, essentially. And then you have your unconscious mind, essentially. You have urges and wishes that you can't think about all day. Because imagine how insane you would go if you could process all the things you're hearing, all the things you're feeling physically, every skin sensation. Like right now, I'm wearing a shirt, a jacket, pants, and so on and so forth. Or am I wearing pants? Who knows? But I'm wearing all these clothes. And imagine if I just could pay attention to all the physical sensations of all the things touching my skin right now. I probably would lose my mind. And so our brain is really good at, let's say, minimizing the noise of turning down the volume dial on various sensations all day so your brain doesn't get overloaded with information it's not necessary for your survival. So the idea that that's true for sensation has been proven biologically for over 100 years. And I think the same is true about psychological information. So we all have wishes that are not okay to talk about publicly. We all have urges and fantasies that are not most pro-social, whether they be physical, aggressive, sexual, whatever. And all these things are normal for the vast majority of people. And so the idea that we're not attending to all of our wishes all day, I think makes a lot of conscious sense to most people. So it's really, really important to be clear that there's a lot of unconscious things happening all day. Your brain is filtering out how you physically feel, your temperature, all sorts of things, because why would you consciously pay attention to that unless you're overheating or you're too cold, for instance? But there's some range of normal temperature that you're not going to think about all day. The same thing's true for other wishes, like, again, the easy examples, aggressive wishes or sexual wishes. So the idea that people use defense mechanisms all day to just stay sane, I think is fair. I think we do a lot of different types of defenses all day. And I'm just going to list some of them and explain why I think it's common for people to use these defenses all day. So 2 examples of defenses that are the so-called mature defense mechanisms from a technical perspective. And by the way, what mature means in this context psychoanalytically is that these are the defense mechanisms that developed adults would use that allow them to have a more complicated relationship with their mind. Whereas the more immature defense mechanisms are the one that infants rely on to stay psychologically stable. So the mature defense mechanisms include humor and joking around, intellectualizing, like over-explaining, like I'm doing, sublimating, like taking a negative wish or impulse and turning it into productive energy, and sometimes suppression, like consciously withholding information from your conscious mind, like making a conscious choice to do so. Those are 4 examples of mature defense mechanisms. So just to give some examples. People often make jokes all day long about difficult topics, political topics, personal topics, tragedies of life, things like that. I was in a session earlier today with someone who was just part of a shooting tragedy, and the way this individual handled it was with some humor. And it wasn't like that was the only thing this person did, but it was one thing this person did. So it's a valuable defense mechanism to stay psychologically sane, because doesn't make much sense to cry all day. Doesn't make much sense to be angry all day. It's easy to get stuck in an emotional state, so defense mechanisms allow us to not stay stuck in a particular emotional state. They help us move on to the next thing sometimes. Also, sometimes we have very antisocial wishes. I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes. And so I'll give you a very simple for instance. Sometimes, I'm not saying anyone here, myself included, would do this, but sometimes you find yourself out in public. And maybe you see someone you think is attractive. And so you might have an urge or a wish that's not super pro-social, because maybe you're married or something. And so maybe you have an urge or a wish to talk to that person and flirt with them. But instead of actually actively flirting with them, maybe you do something slightly more pro-social, like joking around with them. I've never done this in my life, but other people probably have. And so what I would tell everyone is that these defense mechanisms keep us sane. They don't make us amazingly well or amazingly smart. They just keep us stable. They keep the floor stable. That's the goal of defense mechanisms. So keeping the floor stable is the whole purpose of defense mechanisms, basically. It's an oversimplification, but it's just for keeping this podcast from being 6 hours. And so if the average person needs to use different types of maybe more mature defense mechanisms to keep the floor stable, imagine what mentally ill people need to do, which is the second half of my tweet, just to return to it. So what I said was, and I quote, mentally ill people usually need to rely on immature defense mechanisms, which I'll explain, like idealizing or devaluing, either more frequently or more incongruently with their goals. So if you use an immature defense mechanism too much, it can cause impairment in your life. If you use immature defense mechanisms in an incongruent way with your goals, in a self-sabotaging way, it will make your life worse. And this is true for a lot of mentally ill people of all kinds: PTSD, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, so on and so forth. So let me just give you some examples of some of the more immature defense mechanisms. And again, just to be super clear, the only reason these are called immature defense mechanisms is because these are the types of mental maneuvers that you need to do to stay sane as an infant. These are the ones that allow less intelligent, aware, you don't have a good vocabulary. When you're 6 months old, you have no vocabulary usually. So you don't have complicated topics to do complicated language or knowledge to make more sense of your world to feel better. That's intellectualizing, right? That's the mature defense mechanism. So if you don't have much agency in life as an infant would, and you don't have much knowledge as an infant would, you have to rely on simpler mechanisms to stay sane, right? So 4 classic immature defense mechanisms include projection/projective identification, splitting, denial, and repression. Okay? So let's talk about projection and projective identification. So the real truth is, when you're an infant, because you don't have language, you don't have knowledge, and you don't have agency, it's hard to tolerate distressing circumstances as an infant. So in theory, if the analysts are correct, projection is a defense mechanism that allows the infant to take an intolerable internal experience and put it in the outside world. And the same thing is true with projective identification. And so projective identification is where that process just becomes so intense that you're making the other person feel how bad you feel, right? So think about it as an infant. Think about how normal this is for any infant, around 6 months age. You can't talk, you can't walk, you can't take care of yourself, you can't feed yourself, so on and so forth. So if you're 6 months old, projective identification saves your life. Because what if you have a bowel obstruction at the age of 6 months old? What if you have such intense lower GI pain at the age of 6 months and you can do nothing about it? And so all you can do really is you can cry and scream and wail and get red in the face and keep crying even if you've been fed, even if you've been rocked. You keep crying. You cry for hours on end. At some point, the parent loses their mind. Apparently, this is how it works. Projective identification, a good example of it. If you're 6 months old and you have a bowel obstruction and you're not okay, something tragic could happen to you. You might have an actual injury because of the obstruction. What you should do if you're 6 months old is you should scream and cry and wail until they finally take you to the doctor. Because you're not capable of saying, I think something is wrong with my gut. Because you're 6 months old. And so what you do is you make the outside world so miserable, they feel as miserable as you do in order for you to stay alive, right? That's what infants do when they're engaging in projective identification. Essentially, that's just an oversimplified example, but adults do this all the time, especially folks with personality disorders, serious trauma issues, and so on and so forth. And so it's really, really important for everyone to understand that these immature defense mechanisms served a very useful purpose once upon a time, but are not as useful as adults because they're oversimplified mechanisms for a more complicated life. Because when you're 6 months old, all you care about is eating, sleeping, going to the bathroom, and being played with. That's it. But when you're an adult, it's a little more complicated than that. So you need language. You need complicated ideas and communication skills. So these immature defense mechanisms like splitting, projective identification, repression, things like this, all of these immature defense mechanisms, are seriously one of the most impairing problems for people with psychopathology because they interfere with their life all the time. Like, let's talk about idealizing and devaluing. So back to splitting. So splitting is when you become all good or all bad, and that's idealizing and devaluing. So the defense mechanism of splitting is extremely useful, as they said here in the chat, splitting your pants. Jonathan, if you split your pants once, maybe you should probably get more durable pants. unless you're intending to show off, in which case, God bless, happy pride to everybody. But splitting allows the infant to stay safe, right? If you're 6 months old, you don't have language, you don't have muscle, you don't have skills, you are literally stuck in a circumstance where you have essentially no power. And so splitting allows you to stay alive. Because if you split, if your mom, if the caregiver, the bad guy, the good guy is all good, all bad, you can maintain some psychological stability with them despite bad circumstances. Taxcentric says, what does one do who is involved with someone exhibiting projective identification besides monk mode? I like monk mode. I do. I think monk mode is great because if you can stay as neutral as possible when someone's projecting, there's less for them to try to cling to, and eventually they will wear themselves out. But it can be exhausting to do that. But I'm not giving you specific advice. I would just say that monk mode can work, but it's usually more complicated than that because usually there's a couple of complicated reasons why they're engaging in projective identification. And so you probably should consult couples therapist, etc., or an actual therapist if it's not a relationship partner about that. So again, UnShrink Me is not advice to you, the person in the chat, the consumers of this. This is just me speaking generally. Don't sue me, but feel free to cancel me. So what I would tell everyone is that all of these immature defense mechanisms happen much more with mentally ill people. So back to Nick Taber's post. The idea that someone failed in therapy, there's a really good chance, that if you failed in therapy, it's possible the patient's defense mechanisms are the reason. It's possible for patients to devalue their professional, their psychiatrist, their psychologist, whoever. However, a good therapist, an ethical therapist, will catch that and see if they can do something to repair the relationship. And if you have done informed consent correctly, you have stated at the beginning of therapy that ruptures happen and repair is important. So if you've already set the stage correctly with informed consent, then most ruptures can be managed. Now, some people are literally too ill to respond well to therapy, especially outpatient therapy, like once a week to go see your therapist. So some people are very, very mentally ill and they will fail therapy because they are too unwell. For instance, easy example, bipolar 1. If the person has bipolar 1 and they are not medicated and they are actively grandiose and impulsive and flight of ideas and pressured speech, there is no amount of talk therapy and patience and informed consent that will fix that. Lord knows I have tried with a few people and it doesn't work. So some people cannot be helped by therapy. They have other problems that require other solutions or higher levels of care. So it's totally true that some people's defense mechanisms can also keep them from doing well in therapy. This happens with personality disorders all the time. So back to Nick's point, as he said, if you screw someone over but you don't want to be held accountable for it, say that they're devaluing you. So the truth of the matter is that, dear Nick Tabor, the reason people fail therapy is usually pretty complicated. It has something to do with the therapist not doing their job correctly, but sometimes patients aren't ready to get better. As I said, I think either last week or the week before, the vast majority of people that come to therapy don't actually want to change. They just want to feel less distressed. And feeling less distressed is not the same thing as actually changing your life. And so I would be willing to argue that a lot of the time, I ultimately will put the blame on therapists in many cases, but in some cases, there's nothing you can do. In my little corner of therapy land, which is the world's worst theme park on the planet, in my opinion, we have this little section of therapy land called Rehabistan. And in Rehabistan, there are so many people who come to treatment and rehabs who are not interested in being sober. They're not interested in changing their drug use behavior at all. And they're forced to be there by the government, by the prison system, by their family, and they often will burn out of treatment. It is idealistic nonsense to believe that that group of people is most of the time going to get well. That's crap. there's a large percentage of them that even with the best rehabs and the best professionals who are super mindful and ethical and informed consent and all this stuff I talk about, they're not going to get better. Because if you don't want to be there, if you still want to get high, there's very little I can do for you. Not that I can't support you and try to help you like have a safer, healthier life. It's just that I'm not going to get you sober if you don't want that. It's just not going to happen. It's impossible. So there are many people, there are many types of people that come to therapy that will get nothing out of it. And it's often the case, it is the world's worst theme park, as Jonathan said. The world's worst theme park is therapy land. And my corner of therapy land that I run, it's being silly, is Rehabistan. And in Rehabistan, in therapy land, so many people never get better. And sometimes it's because the family's not doing their part correctly. Sometimes that's because the patient is not showing up correctly. And sometimes it's because the rehab, the therapist is not doing their job correctly. So there's 3 different parts of the system there that could all be failing. And usually it's a combination. But I ultimately place blame on the professionals much of the time. Not all the time, but much of the time. Because if the person is engaging in defenses like devaluation or idealization, you have to be aware of that and speak to it. Because therapy is a professional relationship. It's your job to call out what you see happening in the relationship. So, all that is to say is that I imagine, dear Nick Tabor, that many people who come online and complain about therapy not working, there's probably a pretty good chance that they are splitting. And they're not being fully honest and talking in full detail about all the things that they did not do in the relationship. I believe that many patients lie to their therapists. And I don't know what to tell you, but like, as intelligent as I think I am, if you are lying to me, even if I know it, I can't do anything about that. Your inability to tell the truth and have a closer relationship with me is your problem. I can do my part to explain what I think is happening and kind of like plant a flag in the ground and say, hey, something is happening between us. I feel like you're holding back. Something seems wrong. You can do that as a therapist, but I can't make you tell the truth. I can't make you talk to me about this thing that feels uncomfortable or this thing you don't want to talk about. So there's only so much we can't do as professionals. Now, am I trying to excuse all professionals? No. Some therapists are terrible. Some therapists are gurus. Other therapists are charlatans. And so it is the case that many people suck at their job. And I'm so happy that ChatGPT and Claude and all these things are going to replace them. And God bless. I cannot wait. It cannot come quickly enough, etc. But what I will say is that for the therapists that don't suck, that are just like decent people that are trying their best and are not like evil morons or whatever, which is a number of them, sometimes patients aren't doing their part. And sometimes the therapist could do better at helping them do their part and showing up better. Sometimes there's nothing we can do. In solution-focused therapy, there's 3 types of patients. Jonathan will probably appreciate this in the chat, right? So we have the complainant, we have the visitor, and the customer. Most of the time, the visitor type of patient, there's not much we can do. We can try to find the hidden customer, so to speak, but sometimes we can't because sometimes they just have no interest in actually changing. And there's a sizable group of people that come to therapy, that come to rehab, that come to coaching, counseling, couples therapy, that have no interest in changing, or their interest in changing waxes and wanes depending upon how they feel. And so a skilled therapist can follow the fact that there's an ebb and flow to their motivation to change, but a lot of therapists are stuck in their head, or they suck at their job, or they're not good at maintaining rapport with, because of countertransference issues that I talk about all the time in this podcast. And so all this is to say, dear Nick Tabor, that I think you might be oversimplifying the problem. Sometimes the patients are the problem. Sometimes the therapist is the problem. Sometimes both parties have failed. And that does happen. And so, yes, I see defense mechanisms at play all the time when people come complain about psychiatry and psychology on Twitter. Which means that we probably shouldn't take very seriously what people say online about their personal therapy experiences because you're only getting one side of the story and you're probably not getting a full accounting of what happened in therapy. You're probably getting a very biased accounting of what happened in therapy. You know? So yes, as I said in my post, defense mechanisms are real. People use them all day. I didn't say mentally ill people use them all day. I said people use them all day. So what I will tell all of us is that if you are trying to grow in therapy and counseling and coaching or whatever you're in, one question you might want to be thinking about, perhaps, is what defense mechanisms do I regularly rely on? And how is that serving me? Those are good questions. Those two questions as a pair are very helpful because when we realize that we do a lot of intellectualizing or a lot of sublimation, maybe we might over-rely on a particular defense mechanism. That does happen sometimes, right? Like, so people diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, they overly rely on the grandiose defense. And that's bad for them because you can't be perfect and special all day. You're going to be miserable because the world's not going to treat you special all day. Inspired by Reason says, no one accuses Nick of having defense mechanisms. Well, I, right now, here and now, in the year of our Lord 2026, on Saturday, June 27th, dear Inspired by Reason, I accuse Nick Tabor of having defense mechanisms. I believe Nick Tabor does a lot of splitting on Twitter. All good, all bad. I believe he does a lot of splitting. Based upon what I have experienced and observed and interacted with him about, I believe he does a lot of splitting. And do I think he is a bad person for that? No, I think he is a regular person. Because people use defense mechanisms all the time, especially on Twitter. People do a bunch of splitting on Twitter. Oh, you're a MAGA? Screw you. Oh, you're a liberal? Screw you. Oh, you're straight? Fuck you. You're gay? Happy Pride? Screw you. Like, people split all the time, and it's really dumb. But it's what we do. We are, let's say, built with the capacity to split. It doesn't go away just because we get older and we get healthier. Splitting still happens even in the healthiest of people. We just try to do it less and not let it ruin our lives like it does for people who are struggling. I think Nick is great too, Inspired by Reason. I think he's awesome, and I'm glad he's out there pushing back on people. And this is my attempt to push back on him because I believe he needs pushback like the rest of us. Ryan says, splitting is fun. Taxcentric says, can you talk about vulnerable narcissism? Yes, I can talk about vulnerable narcissism, but I can't talk about it today. But you know what? At me on Twitter so I can remember and save it. Excuse me. And I will talk about vulnerable narcissism next week. How does that sound? I hope that sounds okay because we're running out of time and I have lots to say about that. So, defense mechanisms, they are real. Everybody uses them, and we use them to stay sane, to stay stable. Because if we don't stay stable, life gets messy. So we're trying to stay stable. You know, defense mechanisms keep the psychological floor level. That's all it is. Thank you. Bless you. So I hope all of this has made a lot of sense to you guys today. Because genuinely speaking, this is an important topic, I believe. I believe, genuinely speaking, that if we don't have a reasonable relationship with our defense mechanisms, not that we can hack ourselves and become gurus, because that's bullshit, but I think if we can have a better relationship with our defense mechanisms, generally, most of the time, a better relationship with defense mechanisms allows us to be a little more authentic and have a little more stability in our relationships and with ourselves and feel more, let's say, in charge of our experience. Not that we can perfectly feel in charge because that's impossible because we cannot be perfectly conscious of all things. So, I hope this has made sense. I hope it's been helpful, interesting, perhaps even entertaining. Perhaps. Thank you all for being here. So many people watching today. Awesome. That makes me feel really good, admittedly. And so many people here chatting. Thank you all for being here chatting. It is awesome to have you here. It really does make my Saturday in many ways. So thank you so much, because it's really, really encouraging to me. It tells me that something useful is happening, and I appreciate that. So thank you. Megan says, sometimes people straight up admit that change would be too difficult for them. It's true. It happens all the time. So I hope you all have a good rest of your weekend. I hope you take good care of yourselves and other people. And as always, please like and share and subscribe if you don't mind, so we can get the word out and get more people engaged in the UnShrink Me universe of the Psychology Checkup. Feel free to find me on Twitter at AlobhaPatrick, at ALOBHAPATRICK. And as always, I like to end with a joke of the day. And in honor of Pride Month, let me tell you about this drag queen I used to work with. So I can't tell you exactly what their name was, because I think that would be violating doctor-patient confidentiality. But let's just say that their drag name involved some kind of tree. And this person came to therapy because they were kind of anxious and struggling in their relationship, and I have a private practice built around like really high conflict couples. And so, we got to the end of the first session, and as I always ask, tell me some fun fact about you. And again, remember, their drag names is some kind of tree. And I said, can you tell me something about you that I didn't know? Because, like, for instance, I'm really curious about your drag name. Why does it involve a tree? And the person looked at me and said, well, it's because I'm really shady. All right. I hope you all have a great rest of your Saturday. Have good food. Have good sex. Have good fun. Take care of yourselves. Eat, sleep, move better. And I will catch you next Saturday. Bye-bye.